Welcome back to the Dissociative Table. I'm Alex Furches. This is the episode that you've been waiting for and that I have been waiting for, Dr. Sandra Paulsen. And this is the first in a series of conversations about her N.E.S.T model, treating early trauma. Sandra Paulsen is a licensed psychologist and a founder of the Bainbridge Institute for Integrative Psychology. She's been a part of the EMDR movement since its earliest days and was trained in 1991. As a clinician, she integrates EMDR, energy psychology, trauma, dissociation, ego state therapy, and some of her creative methods. She's a fellow of the ISST&D, EMDRIA, and is an EMDR Institute facilitator. She almost single-handedly pulled the EMDR world into integrating the treatment of traumatic dissociation. She's the author of more than 15 books and book chapters and has dozens of published scientific papers. She hosts multiple trainings online, please see the links below, and in person on EMDR, ego state therapy, and other models and concepts. She's consulted for multiple Fortune 500 companies, as well as hospitals, the government at the state and federal level, and even a Catholic archdiocese. Again, check the links in the program description for her most popular works for clinicians, as well as her websites and other works, including an Etsy site where you too can own poster-sized copies of her famous clinical cartoons. So, in this episode, the conversation will range from dealing with attachment wounds through the lens of Jaak Panksepp's neuropsychological findings, the central aspect of early trauma as the fear of the loss of the caregiver and the necessity, therefore, of working with perpetrator introjects. Concepts of the theory of structural dissociation of the personality applying to even a few weeks of age, and using a treatment model of working up rather than working down to access early trauma. She speaks about the limitations of standard treatment models, including EMDR, and accessing early trauma that blocks treatment of the presenting issue. She discusses imagination as a way to access and hear the untold story of trauma in the preverbal period, disarming what she calls the symptom shrine that keeps the uncaring parent or the abuser on a pedestal. There's talk of the practical applications, particular interest of mine, to the predicament of foster children and the foster care to prison pipeline, as it's called, with the relative merits of EMDR 2.0 inpatient programs to her brief therapy model incorporating N.E.S.T. I hope you enjoy this conversation, as I always say, as much as I did. Check out Dr. Paulsen's books, endorsed equipment, and more at paulsenpsychology.com. Sandra, it is so great to have you on the program. I have been planning to email you since I started this, and I'm so happy for you to be here and have this conversation. So,
well, thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, so I did the introduction on the intro to this episode, so when we spoke before this, what we had spoken about was this N.E.S.T model that you've created for treating complex trauma. And I was wondering if we could just sort of structure this series of episodes around these four aspects of the N.E.S.T model. Perhaps we could start with the N.
Mm-hmm. Well, N is for neuroaffective, and I put in N basically anything that works directly on the brain. And so that involves certain electrical devices like cranial electrical stimulation, Bluetooth touch points, or Bluetooth bilateral stim. I was trying not to mention any brand names. And but I also include in there resetting the affective circuits, which originally was part of the early trauma protocol. But it really, I moved it separate because it really does stand alone. Mm-hmm. And underpinning neuroaffective is the work of the late, great Jaak Panksepp. And I had the great fortune of knowing him. And considered him a friend. I would never say that we collaborated because he's a brilliant neuroscientist and I'm a cartooning psychologist. However, he was fond of the cartoon that I drew of his model, and 12 versions of the cartoon later, after he was satisfied with it, he included it in his 2015 book with Lucy Biven, Archaeology of Mind. Only it's a dry version. The actual version that he liked is available. Yes, it's in that book.
I have it here.
Right. And then I just recently redrew it too, because that shows the integration of emotional circuits at the periaqueductal gray. And Jaak's not around to ask him, but I also are my colleagues, co-authors in this book, Ulrich Lanius, first author, and Frank Corrigan. They assure me that somatosensory information is integrated at the superior colliculus, among other things. And so that cartoon, the redrawn Panksepp cartoon that's in the book, is available on Etsy.com. I've got, what is it, Sandra Paulsen's art store or art or something is the name of my Etsy store, where people can get some of my cartoons digitally in full color for download. So
I should get one and like enlarge it and frame it.
Exactly. Maybe that's what it's for, to download and do whatever you need to do with it.
And get my kid to color it in. That'd be awesome.
Well, I haven't got the black and white one up. I've just got a full color one up.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway,
get the black and white one up too.
So that was actually one of the things, because I have the, obviously the when there are no words protocol, and also took that online training and would recommend that to absolutely anyone. One thing that I see working from a structural dissociation model is I see parts broken down, of course, around those Pankseppian affective circuits. And so, like, or combinations, like your classic, like, observer care part, like thwarted angel mother, kind of archetype. And that seems to result in your early trauma protocol being like a dissociative disorder detector, even more so than regular EMDR. For instance, having a client, when you clear the fear circuit, say, what do you see? Oh, I see a little child behind a wall screaming, and that sort of thing. And I don't know if that's something other folks had said, but I was hoping to ask you about the early trauma protocol and dissociative parts broken down around those circuits that you're clearing. What do you do when that family inside someone's head isn't exactly cool with clearing the circuits?
Right. So first I need to say that the early trauma protocol originally was developed by Katie O'Shea, and she developed the resetting the circuits after hearing me talk about a just barely DID person who had, her ego states were named anger, fear, party girl, and various others, and very directly corresponded with the Pankseppian circuits, which I didn't even know about him back then. And Katie went off and experimented on herself, and then after a time she brought me in and we collaborated on the protocol, and I extended it to complex cases. But it's absolutely true that I wouldn't try to reset the circuits with a highly dissociative, structurally dissociative system if protective parts are not on board with it. What I find most expeditious is to work directly with perpetrator introjects as soon as and this comes in the S in N.E.S.T. S is for the self system, where you use ego state therapy to get parts on board. And you have to, I work with introjects, perpetrator introjects, as early as the system will tolerate it. which may not be early, but
Hmm.
I know a lot of people really hesitate to work directly with perpetrator introjects, either because they mistakenly think it's like because outside father was a perpetrator, therefore you should stay away from the inside father. Nothing could be further from the truth, because that part
Yeah.
came in for protection. So you can't reset the circuits unless the system says it's okay. And the most expeditious way I found to get permission is to say to the fiercest parts of the self, the most protective parts of the self, is it okay with you if I help that baby? And it's amazing to me how the waters typically part, with rare exception, but the waters part and allow one to help the baby. And I explain that resetting the circuits comes before. Now, with some people, with some complex cases, it just, you can't reset the circuits
Mhm.
because they all, if you try everything to keep them from sliding into subjectivity and maintain objectivity, it doesn't work, because their first year of life was so screwed up.
Yeah. 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 And so, one thing that Dr. Manfield had spoken about is in earlier and forthcoming episodes, which that conversation's been split up, is sort of working your way backward, right? He speaks about this concept of low hanging fruit. So you work on accessible, perhaps small t traumas, as like Dr. Shapiro would have said, and then work your way back toward childhood as things open up. And you're working your way forward, obviously. And
Well, yeah, and there's a really good justification for working forward from the beginning. And that is, I call it the 3-hole punch theory of life, because if you've ever tried to 3-hole punch 50 pages at a time,
Mhm.
you probably had the experience of going, what have I done? Why did I do that? I gummed up my machine. I ripped the pages. The holes aren't in the right place, when all I had to do was to go 5 pages at a time.
Mhm.
Punch 5 pages, put them in order in the binder. 5 more, put them in order in the binder. The same kind of logic applies with the early trauma approach, because you begin at or before the beginning. It's very gentle by comparison. Rarely do we see an extreme abreaction. And so that's why I formulate it as a third type of integration for dissociative clients. That is, Richard Clough put
Mhm.
forward in, I don't know, the late 80s somewhere, the idea of strategic integration, where amnesia barriers are slowly eroded over sessions. And Catherine Fine, with whom he collaborates still closely, put forward tactical integration, in which one leaves the amnesia barrier between the part that does life or parts and the other parts intact, and you work behind it, almost like a demolition crew might leave a wall to
Mhm.
work behind it so the dust doesn't fly all over and destabilize the
Right.
functionality of the rest of the building. And so I call this temporal integration, because we're integrating bottom up from the beginning of life. And if you imagine a bouquet of long stem tulips and you're holding the bouquet at the bottom, with one hand, they tend to splay out, and you could say they're dissociative.
Mhm.
And then if you take the other hand and slowly move up from the bottom while still holding the base, and then the tulips come together slowly by slowly, gradually. And that's what happens with the early trauma approach. People become less structurally dissociative in a very gentle fashion, without 3-hole punching, to switch metaphors suddenly,
Mhm.
without jamming up the works. Because when you do standard EMDR on what happened with the coach in 7th grade, in the same file folder, a neural network, it has apparently filed all the things that happened with grandpa in the basement and whatever happened in at 3 years old, and that horrific first year of life where there was so much neglect, that might all be in the same file folder, if it all has to do with terror, despair, shame, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have so many consultees find that out the hard way. It's very difficult to do, like, although this is not a podcast about EMDR, this is kind of the world that I walk in, working with the Institute. And so with consulting for the basic training, especially post-COVID, it's impossible not to get more complex than the basic training, including more complex than I would like to. Because if they're not going to say, oh, to heck with EMDR, I can't use it with my cases, which like 3/4 of their cases are highly complex. And it's like, well, the reprocessing is blocked. And it's like, well, we're going back, and the blocking memory is something very, very young, very, very terrifying that you just can't float back to, if anybody knows that EMDR lingo in the audience. And this presents a different way of doing that. You're almost floating forward in a way that's treating at the same time. But with when there are no words, you don't necessarily have to know what happened.
Right.
And memories are not integrated at that age anyway.
Right. The assumption that I bring, and this applies to N.E.S.T, but as I use the early trauma approach in my office, and temporal integration is under the T in N.E.S.T. But the assumption that I make is that the person's presenting symptoms are a shrine to their untold, unheard story. And in structural dissociation, our Dutch colleagues put forward the ideas of apparently normal personality and emotional personality. And the way I think about it is that the adult client sitting in my chair is one, apparently normal personality, or and the child states that we go through beginning at or before the beginning of life represent the EPs and the emotional personalities. And the symptoms are a shrine to the EP's untold, unheard story. When we target, when we work, when we hear the story, taking into account developmental milestones, and hear the story as it reveals itself in not only the client's narrative, but affect, soma, therapist, mirror neurons, whatever's in the relationship field, projected into the relationship field. If you're energy sensitive, the energy field. And then we're going by time period consecutively so that we bring in what we know about typical developmental milestones, and all of a sudden people have access, bodily access, unless they're somatically dissociative or alexithymic or autistic, to the story. And then we can release, I call it a catch and release program. We're releasing the disturbance and repairing it in imagination. That was Katie's innovation. But it also started with Landry Wildwind. She was doing that in 92, repairing in imagination. But, and then we don't go on to the next time period until we repair the beginning. So it really is very gentle, bottom up. And there's no longer a need for a symptom shrine once the emotional part of the self's symptoms have been really heard and released and repaired in imagination, then the symptoms can remit. And we see that all the time, just really wonderful resolution of symptoms that, to my mind, standard protocol has trouble doing. I mean, I'll still use standard protocol with anything that the person remembers if that's really their presenting complaint. PTSD from adulthood, the marriage breakups, the sudden death of a spouse, I'll certainly use standard protocol. But if the presenting symptoms are attachment injury, lifelong anything, lifelong generalized anxiety, lifelong depression, if you know that the person was adopted and that they've had personality trait issues ever since, or just even when people present with traits that they want to change, all those, I offer them the early trauma approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Foster kids.
Oh my gosh,
Foster
yes.
kids. Yeah. That's doing that for 5 years. I'm an LMFT, so people aren't exactly lining up for family therapy, and you have to get your hours somehow. So you wind up doing something like social work, and so seeing that and seeing 9 out of the boys that I worked with, the case ended with the glass wall in between us. As soon as they started making progress, self-sabotage came along. That ritual, that internal ritual, the reenactment had to be maintained.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wish, especially in the social work world, right, that there were some sort of more basic training, maybe not quite as clinical, in working with your model. I don't see any other options. One thing that I've thought about, and this sounds nuts, but is that so the Cytrek program in the Netherlands, I was one of the first, like Professor de Jong, my mentor, Jesse Rappaport, you may or may not know, he lived pretty nearby. He kind of said, hey, there's this new thing called EMDR 2.0. You should take the training. It's kind of cool. So I did, and it was kind of amazing. It sort of treated EMDR like a fist fight all of a sudden. But nonetheless, his results are pretty darn solid. And if you could have some sort of sidetrack for these 17-year-old foster care boys that I, as a early, not quite licensed postgraduate school therapist, was losing, you know, well, after 5 disruptions, there's a 100% chance that a foster adolescent male will wind up in prison. So, seeing that personally, I just thought, okay, well, fist fight it is. That's better than them going to prison. Let's get a sidetrack in America. And I thought, oh, I need to get a PhD and learn how to write grants and get this. But still, I just kept thinking about your model and the nature of this program. And that's kind of where this podcast came from, is like, well, we can beat the crap out of traumatic memories all day long. But what seems to primarily happen to these boys that I work with is a theft of meaning. Like, it's a theft of narrative, what happened to them. And that woundedness was more responsible for, like, the structural dissociation from an emotional brain injury was what, started things off. But living in a continued environment of neglect created these odd symptoms, such that most of them were on antipsychotics. They're actually just traumatized. But that theft of narrative, it's like, maybe you can down all the traumatic memories, but what then? Right. I
Well,
don't know what would you do, just off the top of your head? How could your
I
system
don't
interact?
I don't work with 17-year-olds, so I'm probably the wrong one to ask. But I can still conceptualize it because I work with adults who were adopted or fostered, or there was a divorce or a death, or other significant big T traumas,
Mhm.
as well as people who just have nothing but a zillion little T traumas.
Right.
But so many of these people, by the time they're a year old, they've already had 3 major traumas. They lost their birth mother, then they were in some kind of placement, or 2 or 3, and then they're adopted, and maybe they're adopted. Like, I'm thinking of somebody I worked with who was adopted from China. So she not only had lost 3 moms by 6 months, but she also lost the language she was beginning to understand because she was bright, and the food she was accustomed to eating when she was brought to this country. That's a lot of trauma, And so when we do this, the repairs in imagination, and you you can't repair an imagination without first hearing, any more than you can plant a seed without turning the soil first. So we have to do it in sequence. You have to hear baby's story as best we can discern it from those myriad dimensions, and then repair it in imagination. And what happens is it seems to almost always be about, well, it's safety, responsibility, choice, but very often the chronic sense of being endangered, the sense of being shamefully defective for having needs and feelings. That's the most common one. That somebody feels shamefully defective. There's often rage before surrendering to hopelessness and despair. And learning the lesson that one is shamefully defective for having needs and feelings. And so all the needs and feelings get jettisoned to, here, I want to show you a cartoon. This isn't in any of the books, but let's see if you can see it.
Yeah. Okay.
Up front is the apparently normal baby who has to sign on the dotted line. And in the back is the invisible baby whose needs and feelings had to be jettisoned. That one's on Etsy. I'm looking for another one that goes with that. So baby's jettisoning. Whoops. What's in the middle? Let me try that again. Jettisoning his needs and feelings as a survival strategy.
Right. Yeah.
And so the symptoms I see are the result of the symptom. Let me say it differently. The symptom shrine is memorializing or holding the frozen, unheard story of what happened. And when we hear baby's feelings and repair it in imagination for each developmental milestone, the symptoms remit. So that's what I would do with a 17-year-old if I worked with 17-year-olds, but I don't.
Right. Yeah. The issue, as always, is I do the child and adolescent, like Deb Wesselman and Carol's child and adolescent trainings. That's usually what I help out with. And there's always that dynamic between doing it well and doing it fast. Like, this kid's going to disrupt. What are we going to do? Well, you can't do a bad job. You just have to try your best. And so that's, what you said was fascinating, because we usually think of these. Okay, so shout out to my SD crowd or whatever. Usually think of these action systems as breaking down at a much later date, right? Like 3 or 4 or 5 or something like that. But you're speaking about the exact same concepts of why those action systems would dissociate and begin to become more elaborate and emancipated at an even earlier age. It's for the exact same reason of, like, the little baby in the boat, right? Like, kids understand death way better than adults. Like, this isn't exactly a philosophy program, right? But I know from your trainings that you're not exactly a reductive materialist, and neither am I. So, or else you wouldn't have this question about drop into that time period from before you were born. I loved the crowd reaction to that in your When There Are No Words training. That was hilarious. But in any case, it's like kids understand.
And to be fair, I don't expect people to remember before they're born.
Right.
But you can still access at least cognitions about before that one hadn't slowed down to think about. But go on.
Yeah. It's the idea of death as loss, right? As loss, and that idea of sacrificing anything to avoid the loss of the caregiver seems to be something that what you're saying is that can happen at 3 months old.
Right. A child will do anything anything to keep mom on the pedestal, no matter how wobbly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, which is on the, on a lot of these dissociation tests, it's like, how much do you obsess about how little your parents paid attention to you? Thanks for listening, and a big thank you to Sandra. In the next segment of our conversation, we'll be speaking about how Dr. Paulsen incorporates neurofeedback interventions that don't cost a fortune. And she'll be moving on to the E in N.E.S.T, standing for embodied, speaking about somatic interventions that she argues, without using somatic interventions, you really aren't treating complex trauma because you're not treating the whole client. Some new medical interventions for alexithymia or somatic dissociation. The similarities of somatic dissociation to split brain studies and the role of hemispheric specialization. One very interesting component of the next segment of the conversation is doing complex trauma work as team treatment, including the challenges of that and the risks, dealing with some misconceptions about repressed memories and that concept, and also the limitations of certain modalities otherwise successful in treating dissociation without special modifications, including EMDR. We hope you'll join us then. And again, as always, our music, intro and outro, is provided by the band Crack Machine, generously donated in support of access to effective trauma treatment worldwide. Thank you, and we hope to see you soon on the Dissociative Table podcast.